Good morning, everyone. That is a hard act to follow because everyone is so excited to hear about the STM trends every year. I know, and Hilka and colleagues are such a meaty topic for us today. Tracy and I are going to be speaking about a report that hopefully many of you have already seen or had a chance to take a look at or read a summary of. But we're going to give a quick overview and introduction. Thank you to Hilka and colleagues for such a meaty start to the morning. I said something like that already, and we're thrilled to have a chance to talk about our report now. We are going to get to AI this morning in this presentation, I promise you. But before we do that, we're going to talk about some of the underlying strategic dynamics that undergird any kind of consideration of AI. So we'll get there, but we want to talk about some other things first. And the reason for that is because we did this project before AI became all-consuming for so many of us here in the STM community. Let me start with just a thank you or two. The work that we're going to be speaking about today was sponsored by STM and a number of the members. So thank you all to those of you who played a role in making this work possible in that way, and also those of you who served as interviewees or reviewers or otherwise engaged in the substance of the project along the way. We issued a draft. We got some wonderful community feedback. So thank you to the STM community and well beyond the scholarly communications community that engaged in the production and creation of the project. We published the paper in January, having done the research for it in 2023. And have seen some really substantial engagement and readership since then. So thank you. Let me talk about three of the key takeaways that we'd like to foreground for everyone. And actually, before I do that, should I tell you what we did? Maybe I should tell you what we did, huh? So this was an effort to look at the infrastructure that supports scholarly publishing and scholarly communication. It was an effort to look at the shared infrastructure that goes beyond any single publisher or any single library, any single researcher, that kind of stitches our work together, enables it, and makes it possible. And so what we did was we went out and spoke to a whole lot of people and tried to learn a lot about both some of the underlying strategic dynamics as well as some of the dynamics around the actual infrastructure that we're faced with. So here were those three takeaways. First of all, at a basic strategic level, we've been living through what we characterized as the second digital transformation of scholarly publishing, a moment where we were moving beyond just taking print materials and making them digital towards one where we have begun to grapple with both the affordances and the threats and risks of digital first thinking and digital first work. Second was that the competitiveness of the shared infrastructure influences the competitiveness of the scholarly publishing sector and vice versa. So put another way, when there's a competitive market in certain key parts of the shared infrastructure, that makes it possible for there to be a competitive marketplace for scholarly publishing. And as the one consolidates and consolidates and consolidates, that causes consolidation in the other as well. So there's kind of an influence back and forth in terms of enabling market competition. And then third, we saw a whole array of new needs for shared infrastructure. And that includes new kinds of investments, new kinds of approaches to strategic governance of the shared infrastructure, and that connects across different kinds of market participants. So what we tried to emphasize in a lot of our recommendations was that, in fact, it's not just a question of what can the STM community or what can the library community or what can the research officers community, what could each of them do separately, but rather there are a number of cases where the best solutions seem likely to come from efforts to collaborate and engage across those and funders and other kinds of market participants. So let me share. I'm going to share a little bit of the strategic context, and then I'm going to turn things over to Tracy to talk about some of what we found and our recommendations. So you can find sections on each of these in the report. Number one, publishing is transitioning to service provision. It's moving towards a kind of services approach to its work. We heard in the panel just now from Anita some comments about the importance of retaining quality in that transition, but nevertheless, we do see that transition, broadly speaking, continuing. We've all seen waves of consolidation, not just acquisitions of publishing houses by one another, but consolidation in terms of hosting and other business relationships that ultimately lead towards market consolidation. And we've also seen an explosion of competition in terms of new market entrants and startups and new kinds of open access publishers and so forth. And these waves of consolidations and competition make infrastructure development necessary, and they also are affected and enabled by having access to the right kinds of shared infrastructure. I won't say much about number 3. I think Hilke did an outstanding job of doing more than scratching the surface of the way that machines increasingly are communicating with one another. Your comments about the cloud labs, the robot labs, all of the ways that not just scholarly communication, but scholarship and the work of scholars are becoming mediated by and in fact taking place through machines is obviously a critically important element of the strategic context. And then finally, and I will take as much time as you like to emphasize this, scholarship falls short of our goals for it, particularly when we talk about it as a trusted global public good. And that's to say that it's not trusted enough. It's increasingly, there are fault lines around the globalization and geopolitics around it, and questions about the extent to which it serves as a public good. And so we talked a lot about each of those factors. Looking at the provider landscape of infrastructure services providers, lots of different kinds of infrastructure and lots of different kinds of providers, but few of them have really achieved a sustainable balance between some of these key factors that we tried to look into. Things as diverse as trustworthiness and access to capital, right? Which are you might think are how do you balance all of those things? We saw challenges in getting all of those characteristics into balance. And then finally, for me, these are the key rationales that we looked at for creating new infrastructure. Some of the demand side of why we might need new infrastructure. The growing atomization of the scholarly record, the way in which of the scholarly article, the way in which it's being broken down into component parts, not just preprints, but increasingly the data sets, the code, the protocols, the methods, the figures, et cetera, how we grapple with that atomization, that knowledge, what we heard earlier referred to as a knowledge graph. That might be one way that atomization gets handled. It might get handled in other ways as well. Number 2, to ensure that the scholarly record earn its trustworthiness, that it becomes as trustworthy as possible. Number 3, making it possible to draw deeper meaning from individual works of scholarship. We see an enormous amount of demand to not just publish the research of the scholars, but translate it into something that others can make meaning out of, whether that be other scholars themselves or various versions of the general public or others in between. Number 4, we've all lived through the pressures around new business models, thinking about open access, transformative agreements, hybrid approaches, et cetera. And then finally, we heard from a number of our interviewees very clearly their desire for an alternative system for scholarly communication that was reliant less on, in particular, commercial providers, or as they saw it, non-academic community providers, and other kinds of alternatives that could support scholarly communication. So those were the 5 key rationales that we heard for new new infrastructure. That's some of the strategic context. And from here, I'm going to turn things over to Tracy.
Since we know many of you are familiar with or were interviewed for this research, we thought today we would focus on a subset of the 25 recommendations that are embedded without the report. So many of the recommendations explore parallel themes to what we've just heard in the SDM Trends report, or that we'll be discussing today and tomorrow in various sessions. So we wanted to highlight these as opportunities for conversation over the next few days. Within the report, the recommendations are divided into immediate investments and longer-term policy and collaborations. So that's how I'll speak about them today. So in terms of immediate investments in infrastructure, one thing that we heard with consistency is that smaller and mid-sized publishing organizations are unable to create enterprise software on a standalone basis and are therefore reliant on shared offerings. Larger publishers have either purchased or created on a standalone basis key components of common enterprise software and solutions. For smaller and mid-sized publishing organizations that wish to maintain their independence, they may find that the infrastructure marketplace becomes more challenging for them over time. In thinking about this, we recommend that smaller and mid-sized publishing organizations, looking across organizational models and governance types, advocate collectively in this marketplace on behalf of their long-term strategic interests. We didn't hear a lot about the role of infrastructure in supporting long-term access to digital content. Yet, as the scholarly record becomes more complex and heterogeneous, concerns persist about the stability of digital preservation across the landscape and preparedness for different and emerging types and formats of publications. With this in mind, we recommend that regardless of size or disciplinary coverage, every publisher should participate in digital preservation services that aim to protect and preserve digital content for long-term access and use. And think about this as a need that extends across the life cycle of communications, not just as a final component of the work. Under the category of immediate investments in building trust, as we all know, the incentives to commit academic fraud and misconduct far outstrip the consequences at present. And the result is a rash of threats to the integrity of the scholarly record. We therefore recommend that publishing organizations, universities, and infrastructure providers share trust signals with one another through ORCID or elsewhere as appropriate. And similarly recommend that publishing organizations openly share with one another significant threats to research integrity. For example, rejections for fraud, retractions, and other significant corrections. Editorial and peer review are an essentially human activity that we all realize cannot scale indefinitely. Moreover, at this point in time, it is unclear how humans might review components of the forthcoming scholarly record that are ultimately created by machines for machines. While this landscape is changing very rapidly through AI, review processes are developing dynamically today and will benefit from further investments. To this end, we recommend continued investment in automated editorial tools that can support the detection of fraud and misconduct within manuscripts. And finally, and I was very glad to hear this pulled out in the SDM Trends, establishing or reestablishing public trust in science and scholarship is a problem far beyond that of a scholarly communication problem. With this in mind, we recommend that scholarly publishing organizations dramatically increase their advocacy for investments to help the broader public understand scholarship and help them engage with trustworthy science. In the category of immediate investments in emerging models, innovation in making meaning at scale requires access to a large proportion of the scholarly record than what is available through any single publishing organization or distribution channel. We recommend in this sense that a streamlined aggregate technical and licensing mechanism be developed to enable publishing organizations to distribute appropriate portions of the scholarly record, both to one another and potentially to third parties, for new kinds of translation and analytic services. In the area of new business models, we recommend that current and potential providers of specifically open access infrastructure critically examine the opportunities for greater investment, given the need for services and tools to be developed in this continually evolving market. And as Roger mentioned, some interviewees favor the creation of an alternative scholarly communication system that will overcome some of the deficiencies of our current system. Many of those with such perspectives are particularly troubled with the academic incentives that have led to a prestige economy. While alternate models are often mission-driven, they nonetheless must operate in the same competitive marketplace. With this in mind, we recommend that advocates for and developers of alternative publishing models build solutions focused on how to meet the day-to-day needs of authors, researchers, and other end users more effectively. In the category of long-term investments in building trust, identifier work, as we all know, is highly strategic. Yet its historical fragmentation into multiple organizations and projects has at past sometimes inadvertently reinforced outdated models. This landscape is shifting and has certainly shifted even since we published the report in January, and will continue to evolve over time. With this in mind, we recommend that the governing boards of identifier providers form a coordinating structure with input from across the sector, for example, through the advocacy or professional organizations of libraries, universities, and publishers, to address the current fragmentation of identifiers and maximize their collective impact on strategic priorities with a unified vision. Trust and authority in research will become only more complex as information types proliferate and aggregation of content from different sources becomes more complex in itself. And yet most user studies in this area remain focused at the level of a single publisher platform or a single library interface, rather than addressing the dynamics that users experience moving across these environments. With that in mind, we recommend that publishing organizations and research libraries collaborate to conduct a user-centric study of how signals of trust and authority in research are actualized now, as well as projections of how these may develop in several different future scenarios, including greater distribution or centralization of content. In the coming years, of course, we expect to see substantial product innovation and disruption in the category of discovery, collaboration, and trust, including, of course, through the development of AI. In this vein, we recommend that universities, libraries, and open advocates convene to consider what combination of policy advocacy and direct investment will allow them to address these interests and priorities. And finally, in terms of longer-term investments in emerging models, in an atomized ecosystem, it is not clear how research outputs will fit together and be organized, and whether the concept of a version of record will even continue to apply. It seems that a new kind of standard and associated infrastructure is needed to ensure that the scholarly record can be effectively organized and maintained. In the report, this is what we referred to as the spine of the scholarly record. We recommend that stakeholders work collaboratively to design a model for the spine of the scholarly record in an atomized environment. In a similar vein, what constitutes the boundary of the scholarly record, that is the line between which materials count as scholarship and for what reasons, and which are of insufficient trustworthiness in this sense, is always and remains unsettled. New thought is necessary about the best long-term models for defining the boundaries of this scholarly record. And finally, we recommend that universities, through their libraries and research offices, and publishing organizations convene strategic discussions, informed by user research, about how content and users, including, of course, machines, will best engage with one another in the future and how this may affect forthcoming information needs. So looking ahead to the future and from the future. In today's themes of looking from the future, a couple of parallels, I think, with what we've just heard from the STM report. The first is, what are the challenges and opportunities of a blended workforce of humans and machines? And I would add to this, what are the challenges and opportunities of blended readership of humans and machines, and what might we see in this space? How do we think about connections and merge communities, especially in a globally connected knowledge system? In what ways can we validate trust, and how does this need to evolve? And how do we ensure accountability, transparency, ethics, and equity as generative AI becomes more integrated into our infrastructure day by day? As Roger mentioned, the timeframe of conducting the interviews for this research in early to mid 2023 precluded significant conclusions around the generative AI rise within this landscape. But a year later, we now have data to support deeper reflection on how generative AI will affect scholarly communication and publication practices that did not exist at this time last year. So we're very grateful to STM Solutions and a group of its members for commissioning Ithaca S&R to compile a 10-page report on this topic to be published in fall of 2024. The QR code, which I see many of you link into right now, brings you to an announcement of the project that we've published yesterday, including its research questions. In short, we're thinking about what systems and structures will be necessary to balance the needs of authors, readers, rights holders, publishers, and aggregators. And finally, the full second digital transformation of scholarly publishing report is here, and we are very glad for your comments and feedback over the next 2 days. I think if we have timed this right, we should have a few minutes for questions as well now too. So thank you very much.